Hey there, welcome back. In the last video or last tutorial, we talked about sort of the very fundamentals of coding, and you wrote your first line of code. I didn't really go into any details about how that code was working or what you were really doing. So this video sort of builds on that to talk about um, exactly what's happening when you write code. So this video is going to be me kind of talking through this written tutorial, so kind of up to you. I'd say maybe follow along in the written tutorial as I talk, or you switch back and forth, or one or the other, totally up to you. um, so before we go further, maybe I want to talk about sort of a metaphor that I like to use. And I want to talk about, I don't know, you've probably followed a recipe before. I'm not really a great chef, so my examples, whenever I come up with a recipe, are always completely wrong and ridiculous. But a recipe is a set of steps that you follow one at a time, and it's a list of instructions, and you follow them. Step one, do this. Step two, do this. Step three, do this. So step one might be preheat the oven to 350 degrees. Step two might be like mix the flour and the sugar together or something. Um, it's a set of steps that you follow to accomplish some process, some goal. And that's a lot like code. So if I go back to my P5 editor, and this is the code that we wrote in the previous tutorial, um, it's a set of steps that the computer follows. So for example, if I focus on this part of the code, we say background and then we say circle. So we are telling the computer to draw a background, and it draws a gray background. And then we are telling the computer to draw a circle, and it draws a circle. So I like to think of a computer program, or the code we write that a program is made up of, exactly the same way I think of a recipe. So I don't know, keep that metaphor in mind as you start writing your code, and think of it as writing a recipe. So in a recipe, you have like each step on its own line. And recipe, I don't know if there's a word for that with recipes, but they're just called steps, I guess, in a recipe. In your code, the sort of smallest building block of a multiple step process is what is called a function. And so this background thing is the background function. The name of this sort of line of code is the background function. We are calling the background function, which is kind of just a fancy way to say that we are telling the computer to draw a background. And then we call the circle function to tell the computer to draw a circle. So calling a function is a single step of our code, or you might think of it as a single step in our recipe. So preheating the oven is one step. Calling the background function is one step. So function is sort of the smallest building block of code. So let's take a look at like the syntax of a function, so we can kind of look at the syntax that's already there. To call a function, you type out the name of the function. So for example, we typed out background, or actually we didn't type it out, it was there by default. But you could type it out, or we typed out the circle function by literally typing the name of the function. And then you have an open parenthesis, and then inside of the parentheses you provide what are called arguments or parameters. Those words kind of mean the same thing, and I will switch back and forth between the two because I use them interchangeably. So again, to call a function, you type the name of the function, and then in parentheses you give the function any parameters that it needs. And you are likely asking, what is a parameter? And so back to the recipe metaphor, if you think about a step um, in your recipe, it could be preheat the oven to 350 degrees. And it wouldn't really make sense to have a recipe where step one was preheat the oven because you don't know what to preheat it to. So you don't know if you're undercooking it or burning it, or in my case, somehow both, um, because you need to know what number, what value to preheat the oven to. And that is what a parameter is. So for example, it really doesn't make sense to tell the computer to draw a circle without telling it where to draw the circle. So that's why you need to provide the arguments. In this case, we are sticking with 200, 200, 300. And we'll talk about, exactly what those values mean in a second, but very generally, to call a function, again, you type its name and then parentheses, and then inside of those parentheses, you have any parameters that it takes, which are values that tell the function more information about exactly what it should do. So you tell the computer to draw a circle, and then you also include information about where that circle should go and how big that circle should be. And then at the end of your function call, after you close the parenthesis, add a semicolon. This is similar to how, in human languages, you have a dot at the end of your sentence. In code, you have a semicolon at the end of your function call. Where am I now? Right. So now we sort of know how to call a function and how to give it a parameter or a list of parameters. And we can, we've used that to draw a circle. And next, the next question might be, how did I know to write circle? How did I know ahead of time what functions I could call? And the answer to that is the answer to every question that I'm going to ask in the next couple of videos, and that is the P5JS reference. So I'm going to go back to the P5JS homepage, which you can get to by going to a search engine, typing in P5JS, or it's p5js.org. And from their homepage, which is how we got to the editor in the first place, go down here to this reference link. And this page will probably be a little overwhelming at first, but what this page contains is a big list of every function you can call in P5, every single thing you can do in P5. And this is how I knew that I could call circle. So you can click around in here to get more information. So let's click on circle. And this takes me to a page that contains probably some example code and a description, and then examples about what those parameters mean. So in this case, I can read that the three numbers that the circle function takes, or the three parameters that it takes, is an x value, a y value, and a d value, and that is the sort of xy coordinate and then the diameter. And so we can play with that a little bit. So if I change this, I don't know, if I change this 200 to 150, let's say, and I run that, what do you expect to happen? And maybe pause for a second and think, what should happen if I change my x value from 200 to 150? I'm going to run that. And you see that the circle moved a little bit to the left. Maybe I'll move it over a little bit more to make it a little bit more dramatic. And yeah, now you can see that it's, quite a bit further to the left. It's starting to go off the left edge of the canvas. And so this gives us kind of a hint, or maybe a better understanding, that this first parameter is telling the circle where it should be kind of horizontally in the screen, the x coordinate of its position. So I can do the other way, and first I'll maybe put it back in the middle, 200, 200. And that's kind of centered, and I can move it to the right. And now it's kind of going off the right edge of the screen. And, depending on what your goal is, depending on what you're trying to make or trying to sketch, that kind of decides what numbers to choose. And the way you kind of figure out what those numbers represent is by looking through the P5 reference. So similarly, we can maybe play with the y value. If I move that from 200 to 100, what do I expect? And again, maybe pause for a second and think about it. And the circle moved up, which might be unexpected depending on exactly how your brain sort of organizes things spatially. But what I'll say is that in P5, as numbers get bigger, the shapes are further down on the screen. So if I give it a y value of 0, the circle will be sort of all the way to the top of the screen. And if I give it a value of, let's say, 300, it'll be sort of down towards the bottom. If I give it a value of 400, it'll be even further down. And so similar to the first parameter, which is the sort of left and right position of the circle, this second parameter is the y coordinate of the circle. So let me put that back in the middle. Maybe I'll pause here and say that one of the things I like about P5 is that it kind of encourages you to play around. I do suggest reading through the reference whenever you're confused or want more information. But honestly, I think there's a lot of value in just playing with these numbers and seeing what happens. And I actually really like that. I think that's a really cool kind of feature of P5. Anyway, so this last number we can kind of play with, and I'm going to make it, I don't know, from 300 to 200 and see what happens. And that makes our circle, quite a bit smaller. And I could maybe go the other way, make it even bigger. And, now it's so big that it's almost, the filling up the entire canvas, which, might be what you're going for. But for now, I'll make it a little smaller. So to kind of summarize where we are so far, now we know how to call a function by typing the name of the function and then in parentheses giving it any arguments that it needs separated by commas. So 200, 200, 300 tells our circle to draw at an x position of 200, a y position of 200, and a size or a diameter of 300. So the next thing that you might ask is, okay, now we've drawn a circle. What else can I draw? What else can I do? And the answer to that is the answer to almost every question that I'm going to ask, and that is the P5 reference. So I'm going to go back here to the P5 reference. And, honestly, I think if this is your first time looking at the P5 reference or kind of thinking about code, I'd say maybe just spend a few minutes just reading through it and clicking around and seeing the different things you can do because there's a lot. And, don't let it overwhelm you because we will get through a lot of this as we go. But for now, maybe just give yourself a 30,000-foot view of the kinds of things that you will eventually be able to do. So yeah, I recommend just kind of reading through it. But for now, I will maybe direct you more specifically to like this section of the reference because these are kind of your fundamental like shapes, your shape drawing functions. And so what did I draw so far? A circle. Maybe I want to draw, I don't know, like a rectangle. So I can read through here, click around and read more. And I see that this rect function exists, which, sounds like a rectangle. So I click into that. And again, the reference page gives me a few things, gives me some example code. So here's what happens when you write this line of code. Looks like that. I actually think you can edit this in place, right? So that's kind of cool. I never really played with this before, but you can edit the code directly in here to kind of play with it. But either way, this reference page gives you example code that you can look at to learn more, and then it gives you a sort of written description and then sort of the syntax of it, the representation of the parameters or what the parameters represent. So in this case, looks like I need kind of 4 values, x, y, w, h. So I'm going to go back to my code editor and I'm going to give myself some white space, a couple new lines here, and I'm going to call the rect function. And I do that by typing out the word rect, R-E-C-T, and then opening parentheses. And P5, the P5 editor kind of automatically adds a closing parenthesis. So, just keep that in mind. You might end up typing two closing parentheses or something. But when you type an opening parenthesis, P5 will kind of automatically add a closing parenthesis. So whatever, just look for that. And then inside of these parentheses, I'm going to give it the argument or the parameters that that function expects. And if you forgot what those were because I've been talking too much, back on the reference page, you can see that it's four numbers, X, Y, W, H. So I'm going to come up with these kind of randomly, honestly. So X of 100, and then a comma, and then a Y of 150, and then a comma, and then a W of, I don't know, maybe 200, and then a H or a height of, I don't know, let's say a number I haven't used before, 125. And then closing parenthesis, and then a semicolon. I'm going to run this and see what happens. And there we go. I don't know what that looks like. Maybe it's like a little robot with a face mask, or maybe it's like a room with a window. I don't know. It's a circle and a rectangle. But what you see is that when I called the rect function and gave it these four parameters, it drew a rectangle on the screen. So I can move this around a little bit. Maybe I move it to the left by playing with the X coordinate. Maybe I will move it up a little bit by playing with the Y coordinate. Maybe up a little more. Maybe I'll change that to like 75. And maybe to the left just a little bit more. And, again, whatever you want to draw kind of decides what functions you call and what parameters you give those functions. But for now, I'm just kind of giving it random numbers, to be honest with you. But the sort of next thing I want to point out in this kind of P5 environment is that there's an order to these things. And by that, I mean the rectangle is on top of the circle. And why is that? And if we go back to the sort of recipe metaphor, a recipe is you following a set of steps in order. So step one, you preheat your oven. You do that first. You do that before you do anything else. And then step two, you, I don't know, go get a large bowl. And you do that before you do anything else. And then maybe step three is you put 2 cups of sugar in that large bowl. And that's step three. It doesn't make sense to do step three before you do step two. You can't put the sugar in the bowl unless you already got the bowl out, right? So you do them in order. And that's exactly how code works. So in your code, you tell your computer, first, draw a background. And that draws this kind of gray color. And then draw a circle. So then it draws a circle on top of the background. And then draw a rectangle. And because your rectangle is sort of last, it's exactly like you're on a real canvas. And you first draw a circle, and that's on the canvas, and then you draw a rectangle. And that rectangle will show up on top of the circle because you're drawing over top of what's already there. And we can play with this. We can say, I don't know, let's move this this line of code down. So I'm going to cut with Control X, and then I'm going to put it down below the call to rect. So now our code draws background, then draws a rectangle, and then draws a circle. And I'm going to run this and kind of see what changes. And now you see that the circle shows up sort of on top of the rectangle because these things happen in order. So reading through the code line by line will become super important as you get into sort of more complex drawings because the order of things really matters. So in this example, I draw a background and it's gray. I draw a rectangle at those coordinates and at that size. And then I draw a circle. So the circle is sort of the topmost thing. So the order of things really matters. Um, okay, so now we know, honestly, we know quite a bit. We know the fundamentals of calling a function by writing the function name and then in parentheses giving it a comma separated list of the parameters or the arguments that it needs, which tells the function more information about what it's doing. And we know how to use the P5 reference to find more information, and that'll take you pretty far. So the last thing I want to talk about, let me double check that's actually the last thing. Yeah, I think it's the last thing. Well, one of the last things. Is right now our code is our code's fine, but our output here is kind of gray, kind of white, not super exciting. I'm going to put my code back so that my circles first. But anyway, our shapes here, it's black and white and gray, and maybe that's the motif you're going for, but I don't know. I like to add color to pretty much everything I do. And so the question is, how do I know how to change the colors in my sketch? And maybe by now you know the answer, because the answer is the answer to all of my questions, and that is the P5 reference. And again, maybe you read through the reference to get a better idea of kind of the landscape of what it is, but I'll direct you to some of these functions and some of these functions up here. So actually, we'll start by maybe reading more about a function that we've already called, and that's the background function. So I'll click on that, and again, the P5 reference gives you a bunch of examples. So here's a background with one number, and this tells me that it's a grayscale integer value. Okay, so maybe that's why my background is gray, because I just gave it a single number. So maybe let me change it to the number in the example in the reference and see what happens. So okay, that's how I can get a darker background. Maybe I'll make it quite a bit higher, up to 255. And now I have a white background. So okay, now I know how to do black and white by giving it a different single number. And then I get down to this example, which gives it 3 numbers, and it says R, G, and B. So I can maybe steal these numbers, 255, 204, and 0, I think it was. It honestly doesn't matter. Just throw random numbers in there, see what happens. RGB, and I'll hit run. And ooh, now I have this yellow background. That's kind of cool. And you can read through, and there's a bunch of different ways to use colors. I generally use this one, this RGB 3 values approach, but you can use whichever one you prefer. But down here in the description talks more about like exactly what that means, and you can read through it, I think, but what I'll point out is that the default color space is RGB, which means that the numbers that you give it are red, green, and blue. And then each value is between 0 and 255. So you have to give it a number between those two. You have to give it an argument between those two numbers. So to kind of talk about what that means, it's RGB. So if I say 25500, that's fully red, and then no green and no blue. So my background will be red. If I change it to 02550, so it's not red at all, very green, and not blue at all, you'll get, a green background. And I think you can probably guess at what happens if I give it 00255. That's not red, not green, but fully blue. And there you go. And the reason this is kind of powerful is that you can give it a mix of all 3 of those colors. Exactly how you can kind of mix paint together to form any color, you can mix these 3 colors together to form any color. So I don't know, maybe I'll give it like a number like 100 red, maybe I'll just change that. So it's 100 red, 0 green, and 255 blue. So I'm guessing that it'll make my blue be closer to like a pink or a purple. And yeah, now it's kind of purpley, and I can make it like maybe redder so that it's maybe a little bit brighter purple. And yeah, now we're getting into pink. And you can create many different kinds of colors with just those three numbers. And I encourage you to kind of play around with that. You can also kind of search for it. If you do like RGB colors, you'll get more information about, if you want a specific color and you want to know what three numbers will get you that specific color, there's a ton of tools out there to help you with that. But focusing on the code for a second, we used the P5 reference to look up the background function, and we found this approach of giving it three arguments, which represent R, G, and B. So that's cool. We can now color the background of our sketch, but now I want to change maybe the color of my shapes. And how do I do that? And hopefully by now, you know the answer to that. Say it with me. It's the P5 reference. So I'm going to go back here and again, maybe read through this to give yourself a 30,000 foot view of it, but I will direct you more specifically to this fill function. I know this ahead of time because I've read through the reference and I've written, code using this reference before, but if you aren't familiar with it, that's totally fine. Kind of read through it and you'll get a better sense of it, but I'll direct you specifically to the fill function, which, hey, actually looks a lot like the background function in that it can either take like a single value if you want grayscale, or three numbers, R, G, and B. And then there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but I will generally use the RGB approach. So what I'll do is I'll give myself some white space, and sort of between my call to background and my call to circle, I'll call the fill function by typing the word fill, and then an open parenthesis. P5 will kind of automatically add a closing parenthesis, and then I will give it three values. And at this point, I encourage you to come up with your own three numbers between 0 and 255. So maybe I'll do, 64, 150, and blue of, maybe 0, actually. And then after your closing parenthesis, add a semicolon to kind of put a dot at the end of your sentence. And then run your code by hitting the play button in the upper left corner. And now, I hate that color. But whatever, it's a color. Now we see that my shapes are drawn in the color that I told P5 to fill with. And so you can kind of think of P5 as like a little painter inside of your computer. So what you're doing is writing code that tells that painter what to do. So right now my code tells that painter to draw a background, and in this case it's kind of a pink background. And then the fill function says, hey painter, go dip your paintbrush in a different color. In this case, it's this ugly green color. The fill function by itself doesn't actually draw anything. It's just telling the P5 painter to prepare the paintbrush, that was a lot of P's, to dip its paintbrush in a certain color. And so then when you do draw a shape, in this case a circle and then a rectangle, the shapes are in that color that the paintbrush has been dipped in. So to maybe introduce more colors, I can call the fill function again. So now I've put some white space between my circle and my rect function, and I'm going to call fill again. So in this case, maybe I'll do 0, maybe I'll stick with 150, and maybe I'll do, 100. Again, I'm just kind of coming up with them randomly, and we'll see what happens. But now, before I even hit run, what will happen is I'm telling the P5 painter to first draw a background in that pink color, and then dip your paintbrush in a fill color of that ugly green, then draw a circle, and now dip your paintbrush in a new color, which is going to be this mix of R, G, and B, and then draw a rectangle. So now I expect my rectangle to be a different color. And it is. That's not quite dramatic enough, so maybe I will change it to something a little bit more extreme, just to kind of demonstrate it. My random numbers weren't random enough, I guess. But there you go. Now you see that the fill color of the rectangle is different than the fill color of the circle. And depending on what your code does, you might want to organize it a little differently. So P5 doesn't care about white space. So one thing you might do is maybe combine them a little bit. So now I am pairing my fill function and my circle function closer together, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't change what the code does. It just maybe makes it a little easier to read, to think about, and that might come in handy as your code gets more complicated. Okay, so I think that's about as far as I'm going to go. I will say from here, as you encounter things that you want to do, 99% of the time, the first answer to whatever question you have is the P5 reference. So let's say, for example, I wanted to change the sort of outline. Right now, the outline of the shapes is still like a thin black line. Maybe I want to change that. And again, you can read through this, but I'll direct you to a couple functions like stroke, which is a lot like fill, but changes the color of the outside of the shape versus the inside of the shape, which fill changes. And the other one is maybe stroke width, which is somewhere. So maybe I didn't do this on purpose, but I'll demonstrate this like search reference feature. I know I want something related to stroke, so I'll maybe look through the options here. And yeah, I was looking for this stroke weight function, which lets you change sort of the thickness of the line. So anyway, that was just one example of looking in the reference for a function that accomplishes a certain goal. So I just used that the outline as my example, but whatever your goal is, check in the reference first. That'll be sort of your first stop. Yeah, okay. I think that's about as far as I wanted to go. Yeah, okay. So now at this point, just to summarize, what you've done is you have learned what a function is. You've learned how to call a function. And again, you do that by writing the name of the function and then inside of parentheses, a comma separated list of the parameters that the function needs. And a parameter tells the function more information about exactly what you want it to do. So you can think of it as you tell the computer to jump and the computer asks how high. You tell the computer to draw a circle and the computer asks where do you want that circle to be and how big do you want that circle to be. So you pass in the parameters to the function inside of the parentheses. And most importantly, honestly, what you learned how to do is look stuff up in the reference and try it out. And honestly, that process of looking stuff up in the reference and then trying it out is, I don't know, 90% of what coding is. Looking stuff up and then coding. The last thing that I'll mention, I guess, is since I said that 90% of coding is that, if I mention one more thing, I get you up to like 99% of coding, and that is dealing with errors. So as you write code, you will encounter errors. I can't stress that enough. Encountering errors is totally normal. I've been coding for like almost 20 years now. That's a scary thing to realize, but almost 20 years, most of my life. And I still encounter errors every single day. If I'm writing code, I am encountering errors. It's totally normal. And I mention that like so specifically because if this is your first time writing code, you might be expecting that when you write code, you know in your brain what code to write, and then you type it out, and then it works. And that's not at all how it works. The way it works is you start with a goal, like, I don't know, I want to draw a cat. And then you have to think about, how do I do that? And then you maybe break it down. Okay, so a cat face is maybe a circle with the ears is maybe triangles. And then you ask yourself, okay, how do I draw a circle? How do I draw triangles? How do I draw whiskers? Whatever it is. Um, you break that down into smaller pieces, and then you look that up in the reference. And you look up each small piece in the reference. You read more about drawing a circle, drawing a triangle, drawing a line, whatever it is, and then you try it out. And I mention all of this because you will get errors. So let's say, I don't know, I'm going to introduce a random error. So let's say that I typed out the circle function, I called the circle function, and then I forgot to add my closing parenthesis. This will especially happen if you're like copy pasting code. So although it might feel easier to copy paste code, I really recommend typing out your code. It'll be less headaches in the long run. So anyway, I've forgotten my parenthesis, and the first kind of clue I get is that the P5 editor will underline something and maybe give you this like red kind of highlight in the line number column over here. And in this case, the error is expected closing parenthesis and instead saw fill. So that's P5 saying, hey, wait, I'm pretty sure you need a parenthesis here. But let's say I didn't see that and I hit run. I'll get this error, which is maybe a little bit more obvious because now it's kind of screaming at me, and it's saying syntax error, missing closing parenthesis after argument list, and it kind of highlights a specific line. And I think if I expand this, it'll even tell me more information. So it's sketch.js, which is this file here, on line 9, which is here, line 9, missing parenthesis after argument list. So that'll give you the hint that the error is here, and then you can think to yourself, oh, right, the syntax, or what I need to type for calling a function, is an opening parenthesis and then a list of arguments and then a closing parenthesis and then a semicolon. So I can do that to sort of fix my error. Other common errors you'll likely encounter are you'll probably delete that closing curly brace. That will likely happen. So if you run that and see what happens, you'll get this error, unexpected end of input, and it will be on line 13 here. That's telling you that P5 sort of reached the end of your code before it thought it would. And in this case, that means that you need your closing curly brace. And we'll talk more about exactly why you need those in later lessons. But for now, just know that when you encounter errors, those are the kinds of things to look for. So another hint that I'll throw out is, this is one reason I write like one line of code at a time, and then I hit run. I test it out one line of code at a time, because if I would try to write like every single line of code and then run it, I'm going to have 100 errors and I won't know where to start. So anyway, that's the last thing I wanted to mention, because now you know like 99% of what coding is. It's looking stuff up in the reference, trying it out, and then fixing the errors that inevitably occur. Okay, that has been way too much of me talking, so I think that's about where I'm going to end it. I will say, like I said, officially, you are now a coder. You have seen the process of what writing code looks like. It is looking stuff up, trying stuff out, and fixing that stuff when it breaks. The very, 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 very last thing I'll mention is, since you're using P5, one of the really cool things is that you can save your sketches and share them. So I just hit Control S on my computer, but make sure you're logged in so that you see your name up in the corner, and then that lets you save your sketch. And then you can send this URL to people. You can post that on social media or whatever, and that will take them here, where they'll be able to run your code and see the output. You can also go up here to the sort of file, actually, where is it? Yeah, file share menu, and then you'll have other options for other things to share. So if you want to share the full screen, or if you have a web page that you want to embed it in, these are other links that you can use. So this is the sort of full screen version that you might post or send to folks. And okay, that's what I'm calling it. The last thing I'll say is, now you have the sort of ability to stretch your coding muscles, and I'll encourage you to draw something. Draw really anything. Draw a smiley face, draw a cat, draw your favorite emoji, whatever it is, by doing the process that I've kind of outlined in this video, by looking stuff up in the reference, trying stuff out, fixing your problems when they break, and iterating and going forward from there. Awesome. Thanks for watching. I really look forward to seeing what y'all create, and please stay in touch, and I'll see you in the next video where we will learn about using variables to make our lives a little easier. All right. See you for now.